They did not give me a warning. That was the part I kept returning to in the months that followed. No prior notice. No quiet conversation in a side corridor. No whispered heads-up from a sympathetic delegate. One moment I was standing at Earth's assigned podium in the Grand Chamber of the Galactic Council, waiting for a routine session on interstellar shipping lanes, and the next moment, the chamber marshal was reading out a motion I had never seen before in my life. My name is Sira Voss. I was Earth's lead diplomatic representative to the Galactic Council for 11 years. I had attended 462 sessions in that chamber. I had negotiated grain contracts for colonies that were starving and argued resource-sharing agreements while 6 species tried to talk over me simultaneously. I was not easily rattled. But nothing in 11 years had prepared me for this. The marshal's voice was calm. It was always calm. That was the thing about the Velhari species. Their vocal cords physically could not produce distress. Every word they spoke came out in the same smooth, even tone, whether they were announcing a trade deal or ending your world. And so, when Marshal Oren read out the motion, a motion filed jointly by 14 member species, calling for the immediate suspension and permanent exclusion of Earth from the Galactic Council, it sounded like he was reading a weather report. I did not move. My aide, a young man named Colin Price, was standing 2 steps behind me. I heard him pull a sharp breath. I did not turn around. The chamber held 43 species on a standard session day. Every seat was full. The overhead lighting in the grand chamber was blue-white and it never flickered. It had not flickered in the 200 years the building had existed. Everything in that room was designed to project permanence, stability, the unshakable weight of galactic order. Tall curved walls that rose 30 meters, transparent panels looking out onto the orbital ring of Thelos Station. The faint hum of gravity stabilizers running beneath the floor. I stood in the middle of all that permanence and listened to them vote me out of it. The motion required a 2/3 majority to pass. It received 14 votes in favor, 0 against, and 29 abstentions. The abstentions were the part that stung the most. I had spent years building relationships with those delegates. I had shared meals with some of them. I knew their children's names. Not one of them voted against it. They simply did not vote at all. Marshal Oren completed the tally and announced the result in the same even voice. Earth's membership in the Galactic Council was suspended effective immediately. All diplomatic clearances were revoked. All trade agreements operating under Council jurisdiction were frozen pending review. Earth vessels would no longer have navigational rights through Council-maintained jump corridors. Earth representatives were requested to vacate Council premises within 48 standard hours. Requested, as if we had a choice. I let the silence in the chamber stretch for 5 full seconds after the marshal finished speaking. 5 seconds is a long time when every species in a room is watching you. I had learned that in my first year as a delegate, that silence, used correctly, is the most powerful tool a diplomat carries. It makes other people uncomfortable. It forces them to fill the space. It shows that you are not afraid. Then I said, "Noted." Just that one word, noted. I gathered my documents from the podium. I did not hurry. I did not look at the 14 species who had filed the motion. I did not look at the 29 who had stayed silent. I walked toward the exit at a pace that suggested I had simply decided the meeting was over, rather than that I had just been expelled from the most powerful governing body in the known galaxy. Colin fell into step beside me without a word. He was 26 years old and it was his first posting. I had seen his face go pale in my peripheral vision when the motion was read. By the time we reached the corridor, he had composed himself. I appreciated that. The corridor outside the grand chamber was white marble, a human aesthetic choice that the council had adopted when they built the station 2 centuries ago, back when they still wanted humanity to feel welcome. There were no other delegates in the corridor. They had all remained inside, moving on to the next item on the agenda as if nothing had happened. "Do you want me to call the ship?" Colin asked. "Yes," I said, "and call Director HFY at the Foreign Ministry. Tell him the session ran unexpectedly long." Colin glanced at me, just that. "For now, I want to think before I talk." We walked the rest of the way in silence. The station's gravity was set slightly higher than Earth standard, a concession to the Drenari species, who were the majority shareholders in Thello Station's construction bonds. After 11 years, I barely noticed it anymore. Now, with every step, I felt it pressing down. I thought about the motion as we walked. I had been building a mental file on it by the time we reached the docking bay. 14 species. The Velhari, who ran the council's administrative apparatus and clearly knew the motion was coming since their marshal had read it without any visible hesitation. The Karath Dominion, who had been in a trade dispute with Earth over titanium quotas for 3 years. The Sunai Collective, who had never forgiven humanity for the relay station incident of 2247, an incident that had been thoroughly investigated, thoroughly documented, and thoroughly proven to be the fault of a Sunai navigational error, not human negligence. But the Sunai had long memories and short patience for facts that inconvenienced them. The others I could work out. There were patterns. There were old grudges and newer fears, and underneath all of it, there was one simple truth that I had been dancing around for 11 years without fully saying it aloud. The Galactic Council did not like what humanity was becoming. We were not becoming violent. That was the interesting part. The Council had seen violent species before and knew how to handle them. You surrounded them, contained them, and gradually made them too economically dependent to act on their impulses. Humans were not that problem. The problem was that humans kept proposing things. We kept suggesting changes. We kept filing amendments and raising motions for reform and publishing research that pointed out structural inefficiencies in the Council's own systems. We had filed 17 formal objections to Council decisions in 11 years. 17. The next highest number from any species in that period was 4. We were, to put it plainly, exhausting. And when a body of power finds something exhausting, it eventually looks for a way to remove it. The transport that carried us back to Earth took 19 hours through the standard jump corridor. I spent most of that time in my cabin, at my desk, with a pot of tea going cold beside me and a blank page on my screen. I was not writing a speech. I was not drafting an official response. I was writing a list. On one side of the page, I wrote everything Earth had lost. The Council maintained jump corridor access would add weeks to any interstellar transit route. The frozen trade agreements would hurt 3 of our outer colonies almost immediately. The diplomatic network I had built over 11 years, the informal relationships, the corridor conversations, the small trusted channels that were often more useful than any official process, all of that was effectively severed. We had lost legitimacy in the eyes of species who had not yet chosen sides. We had lost the seat at the table. It was a serious list. I did not minimize it. Then, on the other side of the page, I wrote what they had lost by excluding us. The first item was Earth's shipbuilding capability, which was currently unmatched in the outer systems. The second was our terraforming technology, which we had not shared with any council member because we had been arguing about the licensing terms for 7 years and had never reached agreement. The third was our long-range sensor network, 20 years of construction, covering the buffer zones between council space and the deep unmapped regions where no species had bothered to look. The fourth was our people. Not our soldiers, our people. Humans, specifically, had a characteristic that I had observed in hundreds of diplomatic sessions and never quite been able to describe until I sat in that transport cabin with cold tea and a blank page. We did not accept final answers. Every other species I had ever worked with at some level accepted the existence of closed doors. They might be unhappy about a closed door. They might work to open it. But they understood, in their deepest cultural instincts, that some doors simply stayed shut. Humans did not believe in permanently closed doors. It was, depending on your perspective, either the most annoying or the most formidable thing about us. When I landed at the Foreign Ministry in Geneva the following morning and walked into Director HFY's office, he looked at me the way a man looks at someone who has just survived a building falling on them, with equal measures of relief and dread. "Sira," he said, "tell me what happened." "They voted us out," I said. "All 14 filed the motion together. The others abstained. It was clean and coordinated, and they clearly planned it for months without a single leak." HFY leaned back in his chair. He was a careful man, and careful men hated surprises. "What are our options?" I had spent 19 hours on a transport thinking about this question. "We have 3, I said. "We can appeal through the Council's own dispute process, which they control entirely and which will take a minimum of 6 years to conclude, during which time the embargoes stay in place. We can pursue bilateral agreements with individual council members to soften the economic impact, which will work for a while but will gradually tie us into a web of individual dependencies that limits our independence without restoring our standing. Or—" I paused. "Or," HFY said. "We stop trying to get back in," I said. "We stop treating their table as the only table in the room. We go find the people who were never invited to sit down in the first place, and we build something new." HFY was quiet for a long moment. He was looking at me with an expression I recognized, the expression of a man who sees both the logic and the risk of something, and is trying to decide which one is larger. "That is an enormous undertaking," he said finally. "Yes," I agreed. "We have no blueprint for it." Neither did they when they started. They just had power and the assumption that everyone else would fall in line. "We have something different." "What do we have?" he asked. I thought about the list I had written on the transport. I thought about 19 hours of cold tea and silence, and the slow, clarifying process of writing down exactly what was true. "We have nothing to lose," I said, "and that is, historically speaking, a very dangerous thing to be." HFY looked at me for a long moment. Then he nodded once slowly, like a man stepping off solid ground and deciding to trust the bridge. "Write me a proposal," he said, "something I can take to the Secretary General." I picked up my bag from the floor beside the chair. "I already have," I said. I set the document on his desk as I stood to leave. 40 pages, 19 hours of thinking, compressed into a plan that was equal parts audacious and precise. He would read it that evening and call me before midnight. I was certain of it. Outside the ministry building, the morning was clear, and the city was already moving, ground transports humming along the lower corridors. A cargo shuttle rising silently from the freight district to the east, people walking the bridge paths with their collars turned up against the autumn cold. Earth had been thrown out of the most powerful governing body in the galaxy. I walked to the transit stop and stood in line like everyone else. We had work to do. The deep-range freighter the Foreign Ministry assigned to my mission was called the Ardent. It was not a military ship. It had no weapons beyond standard proximity deterrence, no tactical systems, no armored hull. It was a cargo hauler that had been refitted with better communication arrays and a slightly more dignified common room. My crew was 14 people. I had selected every one of them personally. Colin Price was there. He had requested the posting, which I respected. Our chief engineer was a woman named Kate Marsh, who had spent 12 years running engine repair on long-haul mining transits and had a way of making machines behave that bordered on communication. Our navigation specialist, Owen Tate, had previously worked the buffer zone routes for a private survey company and knew the unmapped corridors better than anyone in the official fleet catalog. Our medical officer was a man named Ray Solis, who had served 2 extended postings in the outer colonies and was the calmest person I had ever met in a crisis. The rest were analysts, communication specialists, a xenolinguist named Diane Marsh, no relation to Kate, and 3 people whose listed function was logistics, but whose actual function was to notice things that other people missed. We left Earth's orbital station 14 months after the Exile vote. The Secretary General had approved my proposal. The Foreign Ministry had funded it without fanfare, under a budget line labeled Deep Survey Operations, which was accurate enough. There was no ceremony, no press, no farewell, just the Ardent detaching from the dock and moving toward the outer approach corridor in the gray pre-dawn light of the station's artificial cycle. I stood on the bridge as we cleared the approach, and the stars opened up in front of us. I was not sentimental about it. There was too much work ahead for sentiment. Owen had mapped 6 probable locations for the first contact attempt. All of them were in the buffer zones, the regions that sat between Council-controlled space and the deep unmapped territories. The Council had never seriously explored the buffer zones. They were not resource-rich by survey standards. The jump corridors through them were inconsistent and poorly charted, and the prevailing Council attitude toward any region not worth exploiting was simple disinterest, which meant that anything living in those regions had been left entirely alone. The first location on Owen's list was a system designated in the old survey catalogs as BZ7 through BZ9, a cluster of 3 stars close enough together that their gravitational fields overlapped, creating a complicated orbital environment that the standard survey models had flagged as unlikely to support stable habitation, and therefore not worth a closer look. The standard survey models were wrong. We dropped out of the jump corridor on the 6th day of transit and found ourselves looking at something the catalog had entirely missed: a civilization. Not a primitive one, not a struggling one. A civilization with orbital infrastructure, with active energy signatures consistent with advanced manufacturing, with tight beam communication transmissions that our arrays picked up immediately and that Diane spent the next 4 hours working to decode. "They know we're here," Kate said from engineering, watching the power fluctuations in our own systems. "They've been scanning us since we arrived." "Of course they have," I said. "We would do the same." Diane looked up from her station. "I have enough to attempt a basic communication frame. It is not going to be elegant." "It doesn't need to be elegant," I said. "It just needs to be honest." What Diane transmitted, after another 2 hours of careful construction, was this: "We are a vessel from a species called humanity, currently not affiliated with any governing body, traveling in search of conversation. We carry no weapons ready to use. We are here because we were exiled from the only galactic authority we knew, and we are looking for others who were also left outside. We have food, technology, stories, and questions. We would like to trade all of them." It was, by diplomatic standards, almost absurdly direct. The response came 8 hours later, and when Diane translated it, she read it aloud in the common room while the whole crew sat around the table with cooling drinks in their hands. It said, "We are the Vreth. We have been watching the transmissions from Council space for 2 centuries. We know what was done to our world. We know what you are. Come closer, but come slowly." I looked around the table. Owen was making notes on his navigation slate. Kate was already mentally calculating approach vectors. Ray Solis was quietly finishing his tea. Colin had the particular expression of someone trying very hard to appear calmer than he felt. "Come slowly," I said. "We can do that." We spent 3 days on approach to the Vreth primary station, moving at a fraction of our capable speed, transmitting friendly signals at regular intervals, making ourselves as readable as possible. At no point did we receive a warm greeting. The Vreth transmissions were consistent and precise, and contained exactly the information needed and nothing more. They were a species that had learned, over 200 years of isolation, not to waste words on feelings. On the 4th day, a Vreth vessel came out to meet us. It was smaller than the Ardent. It was also, as Kate noted quietly from her console, significantly more densely powered than its size should have allowed. which was either a very sophisticated engineering solution or a very efficient weapon system or both. The Vreth who communicated with us introduced herself as First Assessor Ven. Her image on our screen was striking. The Vreth were silicon-based, their exterior surfaces a deep gray-green with crystalline structures along their upper limbs that refracted light in shifting patterns. Their facial features were arranged differently from human faces, but the eyes were large and still, and I noticed immediately that they moved constantly, tracking, reading, assessing. Ven was always watching more than one thing at once. "You were expelled," she said. Her translated voice came through as precise and flat. "Yes," I said. 14 species voted for it." "That is correct." "And your response was to come here." "My response was to find anyone who understands what it means to be on the outside of that door," I said, "and to ask whether they might be interested in building a different kind of door." Ven was quiet for a moment. Her eyes tracked across something outside our camera view. 207 years ago, she said, a council member species extracted 91% of the mineral wealth from our homeworld's northern continental shelf. They used a council-approved extraction license. When we objected, we were told the license was valid and our objection was noted. When we attempted to raise the matter formally, we were told we were not council members and therefore had no standing to file a motion. When we asked to become council members in order to gain that standing, we were told membership required sponsorship from an existing member, and no existing member was willing to sponsor a species with an active grievance against another member. I did not say anything. I let her finish. "So we were not exiled," Ven said. "We were simply never allowed in. Your species was at least admitted. Your species had 11 years. "Yes," I said, "we did. And in those 11 years we filed 17 formal objections on behalf of various species, including 2 that referenced the events you just described. Both were rejected. I can send you the records if you want them." Another silence, longer this time. "You filed objections on our behalf?" Ven asked. "On the behalf of the principal," I said, "that the council's licensing process was being used to protect extraction, not governance. But yes, your situation was specifically cited in the second filing." Ven's eyes were very still now. That, I would learn later, was the Vreth equivalent of an expression of deep consideration. "Send the records," she said. I sent them. We waited. The response came 6 hours later, and it was not a transmission. It was a docking invitation. Colin exhaled so sharply, he nearly knocked over his water cup. I kept my expression neutral, but I felt something shift in my chest, the particular, very human sensation of a door beginning to open. The Vreth primary station was built into the interior of a hollowed asteroid. Not dramatically, it was not the kind of grand construction you saw in council architecture. It was functional, layered, built outward from necessity rather than inward from vision. Every corridor had a purpose. Every space was used. There was something deeply honest about it, the way a place looks when the people who built it were building for survival and not for impression. First Assessor Ven met us at the docking collar personally. She was taller than I had estimated from the screen, nearly 2 meters, and the crystalline structures along her upper limbs shifted color slightly as she looked at us. I had read that this was involuntary in Vreth, an autonomic stress response. She was not entirely comfortable with our presence. Neither were we entirely comfortable with hers. We were standing in the space of a species we had never met, on a station that was effectively invisible to every map in existence, having arrived on a ship with no significant defensive capability. Good, I thought. We are all slightly uncomfortable together. That is the right place to begin. Assessor Ven, I said, thank you for meeting us. You brought documentation of your objections, she said. I read them on the transit to the dock. Your second filing was thorough. It would not have changed the outcome. The Council's response to such filings is procedurally predetermined, but it was thorough. Coming from a Vreth, I was fairly certain that was a compliment. I appreciate that, I said. You said in your transmission that you have food, technology, stories, and questions, in that order of priority. I considered it. Actually, in reverse order, the questions matter most. Ven tilted her head, a gesture that in Vreth indicated revised assessment. Then ask, she said. How many species are out here? I said. How many are living in these buffer zones in the unmapped regions, off every catalog the Council has ever published? How many were never invited in, or were asked to leave, or simply chose to stay away? Ven looked at me for a long moment. More than the Council knows, she said, considerably more. The conversation that followed lasted 11 hours. We stood in the corridor near the docking collar for the first 2 hours because neither party had suggested moving, and neither wanted to be the first to show any social vulnerability by admitting they needed to sit down. Kate eventually solved the problem by producing a folded transit seat from her kit bag, opening it, sitting down on it, and saying, "My knees are human knees. They have limitations. Please continue." The Vreth found this both baffling and, eventually, something close to charming. By the end of the second hour, Ven had led us to a meeting room. By the end of the 6th hour, we had food from both the Ardent's galley and the station's supply, spread across the table between us. By the end of the 11th hour, Ven had told me about the Durin Compact. 3 species, she said, sharing a binary star system in the outer buffer zone, designated BZ41 through BZ47. They have been operating collectively since before the Council's current charter. They refused to sign the FTL Research Accords approximately 80 years ago because the Accords would have given the Council full intellectual rights to any jump drive modifications developed within a signatory species' borders. The Council blacklisted them commercially. They have been surviving on internal trade and long-range barter ever since. And they're still there? Colin asked. They are still there, Ven said. They are considerably more advanced now than they were 80 years ago. Isolation, it turns out, produces significant motivation for self-sufficiency. I looked at him across the table. He was writing in his notebook, actual paper, a habit he had which I had always found quietly endearing, and he glanced up and met my eyes. We were both thinking the same thing. 3 days later, the Ardent left the Vreth station carrying 3 things we had not arrived with. A set of updated buffer zone charts that Ven had shared from the Vreth's own survey data, more detailed than anything in the Council's catalog, compiled over 2 centuries of careful observation. A communication cipher that would let us contact the Vreth station directly. And an introduction, transmitted ahead on a tight beam channel, to the governing council of the Durin Compact. The Vreth had done that last part without being asked. I noticed it and said nothing about it at the time. 3 weeks later, we reached the Durin system. If the Vreth station had been built for survival, the Durin system was built for permanence. They had been there long enough that their infrastructure was generational, structures that children had been born in, grown up in, aged in, and passed on to their own children. There were 8 primary stations across the binary system, connected by a transit network that used a variation on standard jump drive principles that our own engineers had not seen before. The 3 Durin species, the Tareth, the Salyun, and the Aviketh, received us jointly. Their governing structure was a rotating council, with a different species holding the chair on a 12-year cycle. Currently, the Tareth were in the chair, and it was a Tareth administrator named Horus who greeted us at the dock. Horus was short, broad-shouldered, and had the cheerful expression of someone who genuinely enjoyed surprises. He also had 4 arms, which he used simultaneously and without apparent effort, currently carrying a transit slate, a cup of something hot, a maintenance tool, and gesturing welcome to us all at the same time. "The Vreth told us you were coming," he said. "They also told us you filed objections at the Council on behalf of excluded species. We checked. You actually did it. I want to shake your hand." He shook my hand with one of his 4 hands, which left the other 3 free to continue their various tasks. "Administrator Horace," I said, "I am very glad to meet you." "Come inside," he said. "We have a lot to talk about, and our Salyun colleagues have prepared food, which is honestly the best food in this system, so timing is everything." We followed him in. It was on the Duran station, 3 days into our visit, that the shape of what we were building began to feel real to me for the first time. We were sitting in a meeting room with Horace and 2 colleagues, a Salyun engineer named Petra, whose species had eyes that faced in 2 directions, and who was therefore always watching both the door and the window simultaneously without turning her head, and an Aviketh communications specialist named Finn, who was tall and thin, and had the habit of finishing other people's sentences not to interrupt them, but because they were genuinely enthusiastic about where the thought was going. The Duran engineers had come aboard the Ardent earlier that day to look at our systems. Their report to Horace had been interesting. Kate relayed it to me afterward. They had said that the ship was, from a pure efficiency standpoint, not impressively designed. The power distribution was uneven, the engine housing was larger than necessary, and several systems were built with redundancy levels that made no logical sense for a vessel this size. But they had also said, the ship is personal. The people who maintain it talk to it. There are handwritten notes on the maintenance panels, not because the digital systems failed, but because someone wanted to leave a message for the next person. There are photographs attached to the inside of the cargo bay door. The kitchen has been modified at least 3 times to accommodate different people's food preferences. This ship is not a machine. It is a home. They had found this confusing, and then they had found it interesting, and then Petra had asked if she could come back and spend more time looking at it. She was aboard the Ardent right now, in fact, in the engine room with Kate, the 2 of them communicating through a translation device and apparently getting along without difficulty. "I want to ask you something directly," Horace said, setting down his cup and giving me the particular kind of direct look that administrators reserve for important questions. "What are you actually building here? Not the diplomatic framing. I appreciate good diplomatic framing, and you are very good at it, but I want to know what you are actually trying to do." I looked at him for a moment. "A framework," I said, "something that works differently from the council. No permanent seats, rotating leadership, mutual defense, not enforced neutrality, trade that benefits both parties, a structure that is built on the agreement of its members rather than the power of its founders. And humanity leads it." "Humanity chairs the founding session," I said. "After that, whoever the members choose, including nobody from Earth if that is what the members want." Horace looked at me for a long time. Finn, beside him, had gone very still. "You mean that?" Horace said. "It was not a question." "I mean it completely," I said. Horace picked up his cup again, took a slow drink, set it down. "Finn," he said, without looking away from me, "pull up the secure channel to the Salyun Home Council. Tell them we are going to need a longer session tomorrow." Finn was already moving. And somewhere in the gap between that moment and the next, something shifted, something large and quiet and not yet visible to anyone watching from the outside. A door, somewhere in the dark between the stars, swung open on its hinges and stayed there. We had found 2, we needed more. But 2 was how everything begins. 7 species. That was what we had 11 months later when we sat down in the meeting room of the refitted asteroid station that Owen had found in the deep buffer zone. A station that had once been a council survey outpost, abandoned 40 years ago when it produced no commercially interesting results, and which we had quietly reactivated, cleaned, repressurized, and filled with folding tables and functional lighting, and the combined smell of 7 different species food. 7 species around one table, with no flags and no formal dress and no protocol officers telling people where to stand. The Vreth delegation sat to my left, their crystalline structures catching the overhead light. The Durin representatives, Horus, Petra, Finn, and two others, were across from them. The three remaining species had arrived over the past 4 months. The Hessani, a nomadic species whose entire civilization existed on a fleet of long-range vessels, and who had been navigating outside council space for generations. The Brek, who were very small, very quiet, and possessed of computational abilities that made our most advanced AI systems look like early prototypes. And the Aluvar, who were the most recent addition and also the most uncertain, a species that had been on the outer edges of council membership for decades, never fully accepted, never fully excluded, living in a permanent gray zone that had gradually worn down their patience until a younger generation of their leaders had reached out, through a contact chain that led back to the Vreth, and asked to come to the table. The table, at this point, was still a folding table in an abandoned asteroid station. But it was our table. I opened the session by saying exactly that, not as a speech, just as a statement of fact, quietly, the way you would tell someone which house on the street was yours. "This table is ours," I said. "Nobody gave it to us. Nobody approved it. Nobody invited us to build it. That is, I want to suggest, its first and most important feature." There was a translator delay, as always, where the words moved through 6 different processing layers before reaching 6 different sets of ears. Then there was the quiet settling that happens when a room of very different people all arrive at the same understanding simultaneously. Ven beside me said, "We will note that." It was, from a Vreth, the highest possible form of agreement. We worked for 3 days. The document we produced was 48 pages long in the Galactic Standard translation, longer in some other languages, shorter in the Brek version, because the Brek had a notation system that compressed complex ideas into symbols with extraordinary efficiency, and they had spent the second day quietly rewriting the legal framework from scratch, which had saved us approximately 30 pages and several potential ambiguities. The central principles were these: no permanent leadership, with the chair of any session rotating among members on a schedule agreed by all. No unilateral action against any member or external party without a supermajority vote. No member was required to surrender sovereignty over their own development, research, or internal governance. Trade within the compact would operate on a reciprocity model, not an extraction model. And any species currently excluded from the Galactic Council, or never admitted to it, was eligible to apply for membership with no sponsorship requirement beyond the recommendation of one existing member. That last point had been Ven's contribution, and it had generated the longest debate of the 3 days. The Aluvar delegation had questioned it. Their concern was practical. If membership was too easy to obtain, the compact could be flooded with unstable or hostile actors. Their speaker, a woman named Isa, was thoughtful and cautious in the way of someone who had spent a long time watching things fall apart and had become very careful about what she trusted. I listened to her concern fully before responding. "You are right that easy membership creates risk," I said, "but I want to suggest that the alternative is worse. The reason the council became what it became is that the barrier to membership was gradually raised until only species that already agreed with the council's priorities could get in. New perspectives were excluded. New ideas were locked out. The institution calcified. We are 7 species in an abandoned asteroid station right now because of that calcification. If we begin by building our own wall, we are not building something different. We are building a smaller version of the same thing." Isa looked at me for a long time. "You have thought about this for a while," she said. 14 months, I said. "I had a lot of transit time." She considered it for another moment. Then, "A 1-member recommendation is too low, make it 2. I looked at Ven. Ven's crystalline structures shifted. 2, Ven said, "Agreed." That was how the compact's membership rules were written, not by a single founding authority, by a room of people who were genuinely trying to get it right. There were harder moments. On the second day, one of the Durin factions, not Horus, but a younger Tarith official named Cal who had a great deal of energy, and not yet enough experience to know when to spend it, stood up and proposed that the compact adopt an active interference policy against Council shipping lanes in the disputed territories. His argument was economic. The Council's trade embargoes were quietly starving 3 Durin outer stations, and the fastest way to force a renegotiation was to demonstrate that the Council's own supply lines were not as secure as they assumed. The room went very still. I did not speak immediately. I let the proposal sit in the air for a moment, the way you let a hot thing cool before you pick it up. Then I said, I understand the situation those stations are in. I have read the supply reports. The shortfalls are serious and they are going to get worse before they get better. The people in those stations are real and their situation is urgent, and I am not dismissing it. Cal was watching me carefully. But I want to ask you to think about what we are in this room for, I continued. We are not here because we are the Council's enemies. We are here because we are the Council's alternative. Those are not the same thing. If we begin with interference and disruption, we become something that every undecided species in this galaxy will read as a threat. We lose the Aluvar. We lose any species still weighing its options. We make the Council's argument for them that we are destabilizing and dangerous. We become the thing they always called us. Cal started to respond. Let me finish, I said, not unkindly. I am going to bring a food and supply proposal to this table tomorrow morning. Compact-funded emergency supply routes to those 3 stations, coordinated through the Hessani fleet, which knows these corridors better than anyone. It is not as fast as what you are proposing, but it works, and it does not cost us everything we have built to do it. Cal sat down. The next morning I brought the proposal to the table. It passed without dissent. Afterward, in the corridor outside the meeting room, Cal found me. He was quieter than he had been in the session, the quietness of someone who has recalibrated. The emergency supply route, he said. You had already drafted it before the session. Yes, I said. You were waiting for the moment to need it. I was waiting for the moment it would mean something, I said. There is a difference. He nodded slowly. Then, the Tarith elder who trained me always said that the most dangerous thing a young official can be is right too early. Your elder was wise, I said. He went back into the meeting room. I stood in the corridor for a moment, listening to the faint hum of the station's recycled air systems, the distant sound of 7 species worth of conversation coming from behind the door. On the final day, we signed the document. No ceremony. We had agreed on that beforehand, the Vreth had requested it, and everyone else had agreed immediately, which I took as confirmation that we were already making decisions like a body that understood itself. We signed in the Compact's working language, which was galactic standard with addenda in each member species' primary tongue. 7 signatures on a document that, technically, had no legal standing in any existing galactic authority. But there had been 14 signatures on Earth's exile notice, too, and that one had been worth something. After the signing, Horus produced drinks from somewhere. He had a gift for appearing with food and drink at exactly the right moment. And the room became, briefly, something that was neither a diplomatic session nor a formal gathering, but simply a room of people who had done something together and were sitting with the feeling of it. Ven sat beside me. She did not drink. Vreth did not share human metabolic pathways, but she held a cup of water, which I had come to understand was a Vreth gesture of participation. Do you think it will hold? She asked me quietly. I looked around the room. Horus was making Finn laugh about something. Petra and Kate were in an argument about power distribution that had apparently been ongoing for 3 days and showed no signs of concluding. Isa was speaking carefully to one of the Hessani elders, the kind of conversation that starts formal, and if you give it time, becomes something warmer. I think we are all too stubborn to let it fail, I said. Ven considered this. Her eyes tracked slowly across the room. That may be sufficient, she said. I sent the signed charter to Director HFY that evening on an encrypted channel. His response came 8 hours later, which meant he had read every page. It said, "The Secretary General has reviewed it. She wants to know what you need." I typed back, "Time, and tell her to keep the lights on in the outer colonies. We are going to be busy." Then I closed the channel and went to bed on the Ardent for the first time in 3 days, listening to the quiet hum of the station around me and the distant sounds of 6 other species settling in for the night. We had a charter, we had 7 members, we had a table that was ours. Now we had to make it mean something. 3 years. That is how long it took before the council noticed the silence. 3 years of the compact growing without announcement, without press, without the kind of public declaration that invites immediate opposition. We added 4 more species in the first year, 3 more in the second. By the end of the third year, we had 17 member species and a trade network covering 32 star systems, most of them in regions the Council's own maps marked as economically uninteresting. The Council had, in their efficient and thorough way, stopped paying attention to economically uninteresting regions a long time ago. It was one of their structural blind spots, the assumption that if something was not currently valuable, it would remain not valuable and therefore not worth monitoring. They had, in essence, taken their eyes off the outer dark for decades. In the outer dark, we had been building. The morning the Council noticed was not marked by any dramatic announcement on their part. There was no formal statement, no emergency session. What happened was quieter and for that reason more significant. 3 of the Council's primary shipping lanes through the mid-buffer zone went simultaneously underused. Not blocked, just quiet. Fewer transports. Reduced cargo volume. The economic data, when the Council's trade analysts ran their quarterly models, showed a divergence from projected figures that could not be explained by seasonal variation or standard market fluctuation. Goods that should have been moving through Council corridors were moving somewhere else. To be specific, they were moving through compact-maintained routes that ran through the buffer zone's secondary corridors, used jump node combinations that the Council had never bothered to map because they connected systems of no individual value, and that were, collectively, significantly faster than the Council's official routes for any vessel originating from the outer systems. We had not set out to undercut the Council's shipping monopoly. We had set out to give our members a way to trade with each other that did not route through infrastructure we did not control. The economic effect on the Council was, from our perspective, a side consequence of us doing our own thing. From the Council's perspective, it looked like a coordinated strategy. I was on the Compact's permanent station, the old asteroid outpost, now significantly renovated, now carrying the informal designation of Waypoint Ardent, named for the ship that had first docked there, when the Council's first transmission arrived. It came addressed directly to me, which meant they had done their research. It was from a senior envoy named Magistrate Lorne, a Karath official I had dealt with twice in my Council years. Lorne was competent, politically careful, and had a voice like smooth stone. "Ambassador Voss," the message began. They had given me a title I had never claimed, which was itself an interesting move. The Council requests a preliminary communication regarding recent developments in outer system trade activity. It is our hope that this can be addressed through quiet dialogue before either party takes formal positions. I read it twice, then I called a full compact session. 17 species around the table. We had moved to a larger room, with the message displayed on the main screen at the front. I read it aloud for the members who preferred audio translation. "Before we discuss a response," I said, "I want to hear from everyone. What does this message tell us?" Vin spoke first. which was typical. The Aviketh processed quickly and talked faster. It tells us they are worried but not ready to act. If they were ready to act, they would not say quiet dialogue. Isa, who had become one of the Compact's most precise analytical voices over the past 2 years, added, "The use of ambassador as a title for you is a concession. They are acknowledging standing they previously denied. That is significant." Ven, as always, said less and meant more. "They are asking us to come to them. The question is whether we go." That last point was the real question, and we spent 4 hours on it. There were 3 positions in the room. The first, held by Cal and 2 other younger members of various delegations, was that we should not respond at all, that silence was a more powerful statement than any reply, and would force the council to escalate their outreach, each escalation revealing more about their actual concerns. The second position, held by Horace and several of the more experienced delegates, was that we should respond warmly and invite them to come to us rather than going to them, which reframed the geography of the relationship from the outset. The third position, which Isa articulated carefully, was that we should respond precisely and unemotionally, acknowledging the message without conceding anything and asking for specifics about what recent developments they actually meant. I listened to all 3, then I went with Isa's framing with one addition. The response I sent to Magistrate Lorne said, "The Independent Compact has received your communication and notes its cordial tone. We are available for dialogue at a time and location to be mutually agreed. We would welcome clarity on which specific developments you wish to discuss, as the Compact encompasses a wide range of activities across 17 member systems. We look forward to hearing from you." We signed it not with my name alone but with the full Compact signature block, 17 species, listed alphabetically. The response from Lorne took 9 days. That was information in itself. 9 days meant internal consultation, multiple layers of council review, probably a closed session of the senior members. The quiet dialogue they had proposed was apparently requiring a significant amount of loud internal debate on their end. When it came, it was longer than the first message, more careful. It specified that the council's concerns related to trade corridor usage and navigational claims in the mid-buffer zone, and it formally proposed a face-to-face meeting at a neutral station. Their definition of neutral was Thello's Station. Thello's Station, where I had been expelled 3 years ago. Thello's Station, which was owned by a Velhari-chaired corporation with strong council ties, orbited by a council naval station, staffed by council-affiliated personnel. Horace, when I read it to the room, laughed so hard he nearly fell off his chair. "They want to meet on their home ground," he said, "and they are calling it neutral." "They have a creative definition of the word," Ven said. I proposed a counter-location, the Hassani fleet's primary assembly point, currently stationed in the deep buffer zone, genuinely neutral, neither council space nor any single Compact member's territory, well within the Hassani's ability to guarantee security for all parties. Lorne's next response took 4 days. They declined the Hassani location and proposed Thello's again. I proposed a deep space station that the Breck had built in an unclaimed system at the zone's edge, also genuinely neutral, also acceptable. 4 more days. They declined again and proposed a different council station, this one on the border of the buffer zone. I was not surprised by this pattern. Institutions that have always defined the terms of engagement do not easily accept that the terms have changed. The council had held every meeting, for 2 centuries, on ground they controlled. They were not being deliberately hostile, they were simply defaulting to what felt normal. The concept of actual neutral ground was, genuinely, not built into their instincts. I could have been patient and kept negotiating locations indefinitely, but after the 3rd declined proposal, I did something different. I stopped proposing. I sent a message to Lorne that said, The compact will participate in dialogue when a mutually acceptable location can be agreed. We remain open to suggestions. We note that the compact's daily operations will continue in the meantime, as will our members' trade and transit activities. Then I waited. 2 weeks later, an entirely different council communication arrived, not from Lorne but from 3 separate council member delegations, all filing individual requests for bilateral trade discussions with specific compact members. Not with Earth, with the Vreth, with the Durin Compact, and with the Hessani fleet. The council was trying to pull us apart. It was a logical strategy. If you cannot negotiate with a coalition as a whole, you approach its members individually. You offer each one something specific. You create fractures. It was the same approach the council had used against dozens of smaller coalitions over the centuries, and it had generally worked because most coalitions held together by mutual interest fall apart when individual interests are addressed individually. I called a full session that evening. "You have all received the individual approaches," I said. "I am not going to tell you what to do with them. You are sovereign members of this compact, not subject members of a hierarchy. But I am going to tell you what I think is happening, and then I am going to suggest one thing." I told them what I thought was happening. They already knew. The Breck analytical team had modeled the strategy within 12 hours of the first individual transmission arriving, but hearing it named clearly had value. "The thing I want to suggest," I said, "is this. Before any member responds to any individual approach, we discuss it in full session. Not for permission, not for approval, simply so that every member at this table knows what every other member has been offered. Transparency is not a limitation on your sovereignty. It is the thing that makes our coalition different from any arrangement the council has ever tried to disrupt." The room was quiet for a moment. Then Esau said, "I second the suggestion." Then Ven said, "The Vreth delegation agrees." Then Horus, with characteristic practicality, said, "Let's go through them one at a time. What did they offer the Hessani?" The Hessani elder, a woman named Gale whose gray hair and steady eyes suggested she had seen every kind of negotiation the galaxy had to offer, pulled out a single sheet of notes and began to read aloud. We went through every individual offer over the next 6 hours. Some were genuinely attractive. The council was not foolish enough to offer nothing. Some were transparently designed to create dependency rather than genuine partnership. All of them shared one characteristic. They addressed the individual members' needs as if the compact did not exist. At the end of the 6 hours, every member delegation voted to decline their individual approach and request that all council dialogue be conducted with the full compact. The vote was 17-0. Cal, who had grown considerably in the 2 years since I had talked him down from his shipping lane proposal, sent the joint response on behalf of all 17 members. It was short, professional, and left no room for misreading. The compact's members do not engage in individual bilateral discussions that would circumvent the compact's collective framework. All dialogue with council entities should be directed to the compact secretariat. We remain willing to schedule a full session with council representatives when a mutually agreeable location is confirmed. The council went silent for 3 weeks. During those 3 weeks, 2 interesting things happened. The first was that 3 council member species, not all 17, just 3, and notably not the original 14 who had filed the exile motion, quietly opened unofficial communication channels with compact member species. Not formal dialogue, not trade negotiations, just conversations, questions about how the compact's transit routing worked, curiosity about membership terms. One of them, a species called the Marin, had a cultural tradition of sending what translated loosely as listening envoys, observers who traveled to places they were curious about and reported back without agenda. 2 Marin listening envoys showed up at Waypoint Ardent on a small civilian vessel, announced themselves honestly, and asked if they could look around. We said yes, we gave them full access, we fed them well. The second thing that happened was the incident in the Salyun approach corridor. A council naval vessel, a mid-sized patrol ship belonging to the Karath Dominion, the same species that had been in the titanium dispute with Earth years ago, entered the primary approach corridor to the Duran system and began, according to their transmitted explanation, an unscheduled navigational survey. The corridor in question ran through a buffer zone region that fell under no one's formal jurisdiction, but had been maintained by Duran infrastructure for decades. The Karath ship was not aggressive. It did not target anyone. It simply began conducting scans in a corridor that was, informally but unmistakably, compact territory. Horace called me within the hour. "What do we do?" he asked. I thought for exactly 30 seconds. "How many compact vessels can we put in that corridor within 12 hours?" I asked. 12, Owen said from the navigation console behind me. "Maybe 14 if the Hassani fast transports are available." "None of them armed," I said. Owen checked. "None with active weapon systems. The Vreth vessel has deterrents same class as ours." "Good," I said. "Get them into that corridor. Formation flight, passive only, recorders broadcasting on open frequencies. Tell them to be polite if the Karath ship hails. Offer assistance with their survey. Ask if they need any calibration data. Be relentlessly helpful." There was a pause on Horace's end. Then, "You want to bury them in witnesses." "I want to make it clear," I said, "that this corridor is not empty, that any activity in it is observed by 17 species, and that the observation is public. The Karath are not here to start anything. They are here to test. I want the test to come back negative." 14 compact vessels moved into the corridor over the next 9 hours. They flew in a loose but visible formation, maintained open frequency transmissions, and when the Karath patrol ship hailed them, the Duran lead vessel responded with cheerful offers of navigational data, local hazard maps, and from Horace himself, apparently, a recipe for a Tarith dish that the Karath crew would find useful to know given that they were apparently in the area for an extended survey and might want to try local cuisine. The Karath patrol ship completed its survey and left the corridor within 6 hours of the compact formation arriving. The transmission record of the entire incident was broadcast on the compact's shared communication network within an hour. Within 2 days, it had propagated through informal channels into council space. Within a week, I had received 6 private messages from species I had never spoken to, 3 council members, 3 non-aligned, asking whether the compact's membership was currently open. My personal log entry that evening was short. I was tired, and the recycled air on Waypoint Arden always made me slightly headachy by evening, and I did not have grand words in me at that particular moment. I wrote they blinked. We did not. It cost us nothing except some transit fuel and Horace's recipe. Then I went to sleep. But 3 hours later I woke up and wrote one more line. Send the Karath a proper copy of that recipe. Hospitality is not strategy. It is just the right thing to do. In the morning, we sent it. The summit had been 5 years in the making, though the council would later describe it as something they had initiated, which was inaccurate but not worth arguing about. What had actually happened was this. Over the 3 years following the corridor incident, the compact had grown to 23 member species. 3 of those new members had previously been council members, not exiled ones, voluntary departures. Species that had read the compact charter, watched the corridor incident footage, done the economic mathematics, and quietly decided they preferred a table where they had a genuine voice. The loss of those 3 species had not been catastrophic for the council, but it had been a signal. When members begin to leave a body voluntarily, the body is not in crisis yet, but it is standing at the edge of one. The formal summit proposal came from Magistrate Lorne, still smooth and careful, apparently having survived several years of handling the council's most difficult diplomatic file. I respected that. Surviving a difficult file requires both skill and stubbornness, and I had developed a certain professional admiration for Lorne even across a table we had never actually shared. The proposed location this time was genuinely neutral. A deep space station built jointly by two non-aligned species who had no formal connection to either the Council or the Compact, and who had offered their station as common ground for exactly this kind of high-stakes conversation. We had not used this option before because it had not existed before. The two species had built it specifically in response to watching the corridor negotiations collapse repeatedly over meeting location, which I found quietly moving. Two species had built an entire station because two large bodies could not agree on where to talk. We accepted the location. The night before the summit, I sat in my cabin on the Ardent. We had flown to the neutral station on the Ardent, which felt right, though the foreign ministry had offered a larger vessel, and I thought about what I wanted to say. Not what arguments to make, not what positions to hold. I had 17 delegations worth of briefings covering positions in detail that I could recite in my sleep. What I was thinking about was simpler. What was true? What was true was that the Council had been the only structure we knew for a long time, and its loss had been real. What was true was that what we had built was better, not perfect, nothing was, but structurally and ethically better by measures I could defend in detail. What was true was that I did not want to destroy the Council. I had never wanted that. I had never told anyone in the Compact that was the goal. The goal was a galaxy where governance was chosen rather than inherited, where the excluded had somewhere to go, where being small or new or different was not automatically a disqualification from having a voice. The Council, at its best, had wanted something like that too. It had simply calcified before it got there. I fell asleep on those thoughts and slept well. The morning of the summit, the neutral station's common hall held two delegations across a table that, for the first time in 5 years, I was sitting at with the Council on the other side rather than outside the room entirely. Magistrate Lorne was older than in the images I had seen. The years had left some marks, which was fair. They had done the same to me. He inclined his head when I sat down, which in Karath custom was a significant gesture of equal standing acknowledgement. I inclined mine in return. The Council's opening position was the merger proposal. They had prepared it carefully. It was 40 pages, well argued, genuine in some of its concessions. The Compact would become a sovereign division, with guaranteed seats proportional to membership, full voting rights in standard council sessions, and an independent charter preserved within the larger framework. Lorne presented it without pressure tactics and without dismissal of what we had built. I gave him credit for that. When he finished, I looked down the table at the Compact's delegation, 23 species. Then her crystalline structures perfectly still. Horace, who had brought a drink because he said long sessions required maintenance. Isa, who had her notes in front of her and was already writing. Gale, the Hassani elder, watching the ceiling in the particular way that meant she was listening to everything and ready to speak when it mattered. Finn, who was radiating visible impatience to respond. I let them speak. Ven went first, she said precisely and without excess. 207 years ago, we asked to become council members to file a grievance. We were told we needed sponsorship. We were told we had no standing. We built our own standing. We are here because we built it, not because anyone gave it to us. The council is offering to absorb what we built. The offer does not account for what it cost. Then Horace. The Durin Compact spent 80 years under commercial blacklist. 3 generations of our people were born into resource shortages because we would not sign an accord that would have given the council rights over our research. We are now economically self-sufficient. Our technology is, in at least 6 areas, more advanced than the Council's current standard. We did not need to be helped. We needed to be left alone. The merger proposal asks us to stop being left alone. Then Isa, whose voice was always the most measured. We recognize that the Council's proposal comes from a genuine desire to stabilize the outer systems. We recognize that instability is not in anyone's interest, including ours. But stabilization achieved through absorption is not stabilization. It is resumption of control under a different name. The Compact offers something the Council does not currently have: genuine representation for species that were previously excluded. A merger that preserves that would require structural changes to the Council's fundamental charter, not just the addition of a sovereign division. And finally Finn, who had been visibly restraining themselves for 20 minutes and now leaned forward and said, "We are not a problem to be solved. We are a structure that works. The question you should be asking is not how to absorb us, but what you can learn from how we run ourselves." I let the room be quiet after that. Then I spoke. "Magistrate Lorne," I said, "I am going to propose something different, not a merger, a bilateral treaty. Two governing bodies, separately maintained, separately chartered, separately accountable to their own members. Defined areas of cooperation, navigational standards, existential threat response, shared research on major scientific questions where pooled resources benefit everyone. Defined areas of non-interference. Neither body takes action in the other's member territories without invitation. Mutual recognition, full diplomatic standing, open channels." Lorne was very still. "Two tables," I said, "not one. We do not need the same table to eat at the same time." The room was quiet for a long moment. Then Lorne said, "That would require the Council to formally recognize the Compact as a peer body." "Yes," I said. "That has never been done." "It has not needed to be done before," I said. "There was never a peer body before." Another silence. "I will need to take this to the Council's senior session," Lorne said. "Of course," I said, "take 2 weeks. We are not going anywhere." He almost smiled at that. I almost did too. The 2 weeks passed. We did not watch the calendar closely. There was too much work. 3 new membership applications had come in during the summit period alone, which we processed through the standard review. Kate had found an efficiency improvement in the Compact's transit routing that saved member vessels an average of 4 hours on standard mid-buffer runs, and she and Petra had been arguing about the implementation with great enthusiasm for several days. Colin had drafted a proposal for a Compact-wide communication standard that would reduce the translation delay in open session broadcasts, which the Breck had immediately improved by 40%. And returned to him with annotations. Life continued, the Compact hummed. On the 14th day, Lorne's response arrived. It was 2 pages, no excess. It said, "The Council's senior session has reviewed your bilateral proposal. There is significant discussion remaining. However, a preliminary majority supports the framework in principle. The Council requests a second session to negotiate specific terms." I read it to the full Compact session. When I finished reading, the room was quiet in the particular way that rooms go quiet when something large and real has just happened, and everyone is taking a moment to let it settle. Gail, the Hassani elder, broke the silence. She had a way of speaking that was unhurried and exact, and she said, "5 years ago, we were not in any room. Now we are in the room where the shape of the galaxy is being decided. I want to say that clearly because it should not be taken for granted." Nobody said anything for a moment. Then Horace said quietly, "It should not be taken for granted." And around the table, one by one, each delegation acknowledged it. Not with cheering, not with celebration, just with a moment of stillness and attention, the way you mark something that matters by being fully present with it. The second session took 3 months. The treaty that emerged was 61 pages. It established mutual recognition, defined cooperative zones, created a shared navigational standards committee, and included a clause I had insisted on from the beginning: an open-door provision allowing any currently unaffiliated species to apply to either body without prejudice. The signing ceremony was small. We had agreed on that jointly. Both Lorne and I had separately requested minimal ceremony, which made me think that perhaps we were not so different in our instincts as the past 5 years might have suggested. No flags, a single room, representatives from both sides signing once each. When it was done, a junior member of the council delegation, a young woman named Clara, who was on her first posting and looked at the signed document with an expression I recognized from my own early years, came up to me and asked, quietly, if I had always known it would end this way. I thought about it honestly. I knew we would end up somewhere, I said. I did not know where. I knew that if we kept doing the right thing and kept building something worth believing in, the universe would eventually have to make room for it. Clara looked at the document. Was it worth it, she asked, the exile, everything it cost? I thought about the export notice that I had pinned to my wall on Waypoint Ardent the day I moved in. I had never taken it down. It was still there, the original, printed on Thello's station paper, formal council letterhead, 14 signatures in galactic standard at the bottom. The notice that had ended my career as a council diplomat and started everything else. No, I said. The exile was not worth it. The exile was wrong and the council should not have done it, and the species who filed that motion should sit with that. But what came after the exile, what we built because of it, that is worth everything. She nodded slowly, the way young people nod when they hear something true for the first time and are storing it carefully. I shook Lorne's hand before we left. His grip was firm and his eyes were direct. Ambassador Voss, he said. Magistrate Lorne, I said. For what it is worth, he said quietly, I voted against the original exile motion in the internal session. I looked at him. I know, I said. I found the record 2 years ago, thank you. He inclined his head. I inclined mine. Then I walked out of the room and into the corridor of the neutral station, and the door closed behind me, and I stood there for a moment in the quiet. Colin was waiting in the corridor the way he always was. He had been there through all of it, the exile, the transit, the first contacts, the charter, the incidents, the negotiations, the years of slow, careful building in the outer dark. He was 31 now, and he carried himself differently than the 26-year-old who had pulled a sharp breath in the grand chamber at Thello's. He was carrying his notebook, as always. How do you feel? He asked. I considered it. Like someone who spent 5 years knocking on a door, I said, and then one day stopped knocking and built a better house, and eventually the people behind the door came to visit. He wrote something in his notebook. What are you writing? I asked. Just that, he said. We walked down the corridor toward the docking bay, where the Ardent was waiting with Kate already running pre-departure checks and Owen already plotting the return course to Waypoint Ardent. Outside the station's viewports, the stars were the same stars they had always been. The galaxy had not changed its shape. The light years between systems were the same light years they had always been. But somewhere in the space between all of it, something was different, some arrangement of agreements and relationships and choices that had not existed 5 years ago and now did, quietly and permanently, the way foundations are permanent once they are set. I was not done. There was more membership to process, more treaties to negotiate, more problems to solve, more young officials like Clara who needed to see what it looked like to build something from nothing. There was always more. But on the Ardent, as we detached from the neutral station and the stars opened up ahead of us, Kate brought tea to the bridge, real tea. The good kind she kept in a locked cabinet for significant occasions, and poured a cup for everyone, and we stood there for a moment, all of us, looking out at the forward viewports. Nobody said anything ceremonial. That was not who we were. Owen said, course set, 7 hours to Waypoint Ardent. Kate said, engines nominal. Ray from the med bay called up to the bridge, "Anyone need anything before we jump?" And I held my cup of tea and looked at the stars and thought about an exile notice pinned to a wall, and a blank page on a transport desk, and a folding table in an asteroid station, and 7 species who had nothing except the stubborn conviction that being excluded was not the same as being finished. I thought about Ven, whose people had waited 200 years for someone to file an objection on their behalf. I thought about Horace, who had shaken my hand with one of 4 arms while the other 3 were busy living. I thought about Gale, who had said we should not take it for granted. I drank my tea. "Jump when ready, Owen," I said. The Ardent jumped. And behind us, in every direction, the galaxy continued its slow and patient turning, a little different now than it had been before, a little more full of tables, a little more full of seats that had been built by the people who sat in them. That was enough. That was more than enough. That was everything.